The Anatomy of Grief, Full Transparency. Chapter 1. When the phone rings at 7 a.m. The phone rang at exactly 6:57 a.m. on January 27th, 2022. I know the precise time because I was staring at my phone, willing it not to ring, the way you do when you're expecting news that will split your world in half. For 18 days, I had been living in that suspended animation that comes with waiting for miracles, waiting for the news that would either breathe life back into hope or extinguish it forever. I left Trichet's side. I drove back home. I washed his feet. I prayed for him. He could hear me. We shed tears together. I told him I needed just 3 days to get right back by his side. 1 day to drive, 1 day to rest, 1 day to drive back in the wintry weather down Interstate 35. Mansfield, Texas to Des Moines, Mercy Hospital ICU Room 9, was just 12 hours and 34 minutes away. When I saw my aunt's number flash across my screen, my body knew before my mind could catch up. That metallic tang flooded my mouth, the same sensation I'd learned to recognize as my internal alarm system, the one that had been screaming since January 9th when the first call came. Trichet's been shot. 4 words that had started this 18-day countdown to devastation. But let me back up, because this story, my story, doesn't begin with Trichet's death. It begins with a gift that has felt more like a curse, a superpower that has brought me to my knees more times than I care to count. It begins with the understanding that some of us are born with our emotional skin turned inside out, feeling everything with an intensity that can either destroy you or transform you into something unbreakable. I've always been what my Aunt Angela lovingly called Santa, a nickname that stuck because of my compulsive need to give, to fix, to move heaven and earth if it meant easing someone else's burden. Cars, rent, cell phone bills for strangers who spilled their dreams in my ear. If my bank account had room, I'd empty it just to see someone breathe a little easier. But this profound capacity for connection came with a brutal caveat. I could taste lies the way others taste copper pennies in their mouth before a storm. From as early as I can remember, dishonesty hit me like a physical blow. Not just the disappointment of being lied to, but an actual metallic tang that would flood my mouth, a crawling sensation under my skin, a stab to my spirit that resonated in places I didn't even know existed. My one rule, forged in the fire of this unwanted gift, became simple and absolute. Don't lie to me. Nothing more, nothing less. It seemed like such a small ask, such a basic foundation for any relationship. I had no idea how that rule would become both my salvation and my destruction. By the time I was 33, I had lived as a man for more than half my life. The journey to authenticity had been long and deliberate. Hormones at 17, top surgery at 20, a medical transition that allowed me to pass completely in a world that wasn't always ready to see me as I truly was. I had dreams that stretched beyond my own healing, starting a ministry, distributing Bibles around the world, using the faith that had anchored me since I was 7 years old to anchor others who were drowning in their own storms. I know my gift is special. My morning motivation prayer: God, use me as your vessel today and let your will be done. But the universe, in its infinite wisdom, had other plans for me. In 2016, those dreams collided with reality in the form of insurance fraud charges for lying. There was no monetary gain, and the devastating discovery that I had wired $90,000 from an account I once had full access to, but permissions had been recently revoked. The shame of those charges, the weight of my own choices. The FBI investigated and interviewed me and decided not to pursue charges, but the state of Texas had chosen to pick up the charges. I wouldn't lie, I didn't lie, which led me to plead guilty in 2018 and accept a 3-year sentence that would teach me more about the anatomy of dehumanization than any textbook ever could. When I turned myself in to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice in March 2018, I thought I understood what it meant to lose your identity. I was wrong. The men's prison, where I was initially placed, introduced me to a level of invasive violation I hadn't imagined possible. And not by the inmates. It was only staff at the men's prison. Strip searches that crossed every line of human dignity, performed by officers who seemed to take pleasure in my discomfort, my confusion, my desperate attempts to maintain some shred of self-respect. When I reported the sexual harassment, the way one officer became visibly aroused during a search, the way they made me lie on a desk and spread my legs while they got a better look, I was told there was no evidence to support my claims. The transfer to the women's prison in Gatesville was supposed to be a solution. Instead, it became what I can only describe as a descent into a special kind of hell. A million times worse, I wrote in my journal. Though even those words feel inadequate now. They forced me to strip in front of a large group of incarcerated women, made me bend over and open up my legs. My reconciliation is so strong, I still feel the heat of the flashlight on my ass as one officer commanded in excitement for other officers to come look. As if my very existence was a threat that needed to be investigated and contained. That was just the intake unit, though. They weren't sure where to place me. So I ended up in a maximum security death row, women's prison, Mountain View. The verbal abuse was relentless. "You were born a fucking girl. You're at a women's unit," one officer screamed at me in front of other inmates, as if my identity was something they could strip away along with my clothes, my dignity, my sense of self. They forced me to grow out my hair, subjected me to voyeuristic strip searches by female staff, and created an environment protecting myself from being raped by women who had life without the possibility of parole became a daily routine. Stories will be told. Some I have yet to share with even my closest confidant, my ma, whose heart may break reading what happened. But it's okay, ma. I made it home. I fought every day, all day on guard, to make it home to you. For months, I filed grievances, documented incidents, tried to make someone, anyone, see that what was happening was wrong. The response was always the same. No evidence to support your allegations. No further action is warranted. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, a systematic erasure of my experience that left me questioning not just the system, but my own sanity. Not one camera installed at this death row unit to back up the claims. I remember once I was told, "You're a man, fight them off." After a woman named Skittles and a few of her friends decided they were raping me. The first real fight I have ever been in. These prison bitches had me at first. I fought. I threw pans, knives, I bit bitches. I stood in a ripped shirt, one sock, and my boxers on by the time they realized, before they took what was mine. I'd die or kill them. It was 4 against me. What I didn't know then was that my story would eventually become part of something larger. In December 2021, 3 years after my release, NBC News published an article titled, "Strip Searches, Trauma, Isolation. Trans Men Describe Life Behind Bars." There was my face, my story, my truth laid bare for the world to see. The article detailed the experiences of transgender men like me who had been forced to be someone they're not while incarcerated, who had endured the kind of systematic dehumanization that most people can't even imagine. Reading that article felt like vindication and violation all at once. Vindication because finally someone was listening. Someone was documenting the reality of what happens when society decides your identity is negotiable. Violation because seeing my trauma reduced to headlines and statistics felt like being stripped naked all over again, this time in front of millions of strangers. Yet I found comfort that the deepest moments never made it in the final edit. Aviva Stahl, the journalist who investigated my story from 2018, did an amazing job of leaving the worst unsaid. But by the time that article was published, I had already been through a different kind of stripping away, one that made the prison experience look almost gentle by comparison. Because while the system had tried to erase my identity, grief was about to erase everything else I thought I knew about myself, about love, about the very foundations of human connection. The pandemic arrived like a thief in the night, stealing not just our sense of normalcy, but the people we love most. For my family, 2020 and 2021 became a relentless parade of loss, each death hitting like a hammer blow to an already fractured foundation. It started on July 18th, 2020, with a phone call that shattered the morning quiet like glass hitting concrete. I answered on speaker, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But the moment I heard my granny's voice, hysterical, broken, barely recognizable. I knew our world had just shifted on its axis. Sonia just killed herself. 4 words that hit me like a ton of bricks, each syllable landing with the weight of finality. My girlfriend, who was with me at the time, just stood there in disbelief, her face mirroring the shock that was coursing through my veins like ice water. There's nothing that can prepare you for news like that. Nothing that can cushion the blow of sudden, violent loss. The weight of it, the absolute finality, doesn't seem real. Your brain rejects it, searches for loopholes, for ways to undo what cannot be undone. I stood there, phone still in my hand, feeling completely and utterly helpless. The pain was raw, immediate, and it was only the beginning. Less than 24 hours later, another call, this time about Chev, someone who had been my best friend during a crucial period of my life. She had been struggling with the prospects of divorce, the possibility of losing custody of her child, the weight of a life that felt like it was crumbling around her. It was too much for her to bear, and she chose to end her pain the only way she could see how. I remember sitting there after that call, staring at the wall, feeling like the wind had been knocked out of me. 2 people, in such a short span of time, both gone by their own hands. The emotional blows just kept coming, each one landing before I had time to recover from the last. I was over it. God and me had a personal beef, but he wasn't done breaking my heart just yet. Then February 2021 brought another call, another loss that felt impossible to absorb. My cousin Critter had taken his own life in Las Vegas, choosing to end things during a standoff with police rather than face whatever consequences awaited him. I remember thinking, not again, please, not again. But it was real. It was happening. The pattern was becoming undeniable, and I was starting to understand that grief wasn't just an emotion. It was a force of nature, a tsunami that could drown you if you didn't learn how to swim in its dark waters. Grief doesn't play fair, and the bitch hits below the belt and hard. And it wasn't just my family that was being touched by tragedy. In April 29, 2021, just 24 hours before her 30th birthday, my girlfriend received the news that her brother had died in what could only be described as a freak accident. He was showering at home alone when he had a seizure. His body convulsed, and he inadvertently kicked the drain shut, causing him to drown in what should have been the safety of his own bathroom. It was heartbreaking in a way that defied explanation, the kind of random cruelty that makes you question everything you thought you knew about fairness, about justice, about the very nature of existence. Grief, I learned, is like a tidal wave. It crashes into you with devastating force, and just when you think you've come up for air, just when you think you might be able to catch your breath, another wave hits. It feels relentless, and you're left struggling to stay afloat, wondering if you'll ever see the shore again. But even as I was learning to navigate these treacherous waters, even as I was developing what I thought was a tolerance for loss, the universe was preparing to teach me that I hadn't seen anything yet. Grief treated me like I teach people how capable I am at following fully through. Grief told me to hold its beer. She had only just gotten started. January 9th, 2022. Another call, another crisis, another layer of grief to add to the already overwhelming pile. Trishay's been shot. My cousin, 24 years old, found with gunshot wounds in the parking lot of an apartment complex on Pennsylvania Avenue in Des Moines. The details would come later. The botched drug deal, the 2 masked men who approached his car, the desperate attempt to drive away that ended with bullets tearing through metal and flesh. For now, all I knew was that another person I loved was fighting for his life, and I was once again thrust into that terrible space of waiting, of hoping, of bargaining with a universe that seemed determined to take everyone I cared about. For 18 days, Trishay fought. 18 days of critical condition, of machines breathing for him, of family members taking turns at his bedside, whispering prayers and promises and pleas for just one more day, one more chance, one more miracle. 18 days of that suspended animation that comes with medical crises, where time moves differently and hope becomes both a lifeline and a form of torture. And then on January 27, 2022, at 6:57 a.m., The phone rang with the news that would make Trisha Marcine Thompson the first homicide victim of 2022 in Des Moines, Iowa. Another headline, another statistic, another family destroyed by senseless violence. But the story didn't end with his death. In some ways, it was just beginning, because what followed was a legal odyssey that would teach me new lessons about justice, about the difference between what's right and what's legal, about the way our system can fail victims and their families in ways that compound the original trauma. Two men were charged with Trisha's murder, Sam Sando and Salafou Sarr. The prosecution alleged that they had planned an armed robbery, luring Trisha and his friends to the apartment complex under the pretense of a drug deal, intending to rob them of marijuana. When the deal went sideways, when Trisha tried to drive away from the danger he sensed, both men opened fire, each shooting 3 rounds into the car. The trials were held separately, and the outcomes couldn't have been more different. Salafou Sarr was convicted of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree robbery, and 2 counts of assault causing serious injury. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution to Trisha's estate. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But Sam Sando's case took a different path. Despite the same evidence, despite testimony that both men had fired weapons, despite the fact that Trisha was dead and someone had to be held accountable, Sando was acquitted of all charges in state court. Acquitted, as if his bullets hadn't contributed to my cousin's death, as if his participation in the robbery hadn't set the entire tragedy in motion. The acquittal felt like a second murder, a killing of hope and faith in the very systems that are supposed to protect us. But the federal government wasn't finished. In March 2023, federal prosecutors brought their own charges against Sando: attempted interference with commerce by robbery, attempted possession of marijuana with intent to distribute and discharging a firearm during a drug trafficking crime. On August 7, 2024, following a 2-day trial, a federal jury found Sando guilty on all 3 counts. On January 13, 2025, just 2 weeks ago as I write this, he was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. 35 years. It's not life, it's not the same justice that Sarr received, but it's something. It's acknowledgement that Trisha's life mattered, that his death wasn't just a statistic to be filed away and forgotten. The legal complexities of the case, the way one man could be acquitted of murder in state court but convicted of federal crimes for the same incident, taught me that justice isn't always clean or simple or satisfying. Sometimes it's messy and incomplete and takes years to unfold. Sometimes you have to fight for it in multiple courtrooms, with multiple prosecutors, hoping that somewhere in the labyrinth of our legal system, someone will see the truth and act on it. But even as I was learning these hard lessons about justice and injustice, even as I was navigating the aftermath of Trisha's death and the complex emotions that come with delayed justice, I was also dealing with a different kind of betrayal, one that would teach me that sometimes the people closest to you can inflict wounds that cut deeper than any stranger ever could. I loved her beyond belief, and she played with my intelligence. Her nickname was Level 5 Klinger, but for the sake of privacy, we'll just call her JD in these pages. She was chaos and beauty intertwined, a fever dream of contradictions that I couldn't resist and couldn't quite understand. We had first met in 2012 when she was young and reckless, and I was still figuring out who I was becoming after a devastating loss in 2010 that I just refused to open up about, publicly at least. I ghosted JD for years, unable to handle the intensity of what I felt, the way she seemed to see straight through every defense I had carefully constructed. She noticed things about me no one did, but she was immature, childish at times. I admit I hurt her, but somehow, impossibly, we found our way back to each other as friends. Friends who lived in different states but who managed to create a connection that transcended geography, that survived years of silence and misunderstanding. She became the person who showed up during the hardest moments, sitting with me through those secret and very hushed adoption visitation rooms 3 times a week, holding space for my grief when tears came, and never seemed to stop, being present in the shadows during my darkest hours. Our bond was fierce, built on what I believe to be an unshakable foundation of honesty and mutual respect. I had told her about my gift, about my ability to sense deception, about my one non-negotiable rule. She knew that lying to me wasn't just a betrayal, it was a form of violence, a way of using my own sensitivity against me. And for years, I believed she understood that. I believed she respected it. I should have known something was wrong that afternoon at Crumble Cookies. I was standing in line talking about nothing in particular when my empathic radar hit a crescendo. God put one question on my heart. That familiar metallic tang flooded my mouth, the exact sensation of an IV drip, saline and copper, and something indefinably wrong. My skin began to crawl with suspicion, every nerve ending screaming that something was off, that the person I loved, the woman I was planning a future with, was hiding something significant. I texted her right there in the store, "Are you keeping a secret from me?" The response was immediate and defensive. She denied it, called me delusional, blamed my grief for making me paranoid and suspicious. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. So I swallowed it, convinced myself that maybe grief really had twisted my mind, that maybe my gift had finally become more curse than blessing. But the itch in my soul wouldn't quit. For months, that metallic taste would return at random moments, that crawling sensation under my skin that told me something fundamental was wrong. We fought about it. Explosive, devastating fights that left us both raw and exhausted. Eventually, we called what felt like a mutual ceasefire, but our ghosts clung to one another until we finally drifted apart. Two people who had loved each other but couldn't find a way to bridge the gap that dishonesty had created. For 2 years, I rebuilt myself. Therapy, trauma counseling, grief work that forced me to examine every corner of my pain and take responsibility for my part in the destruction. I owned my anger, my reactivity, my inability to let go of what I couldn't control. I thought I had found peace with the end of our relationship, thought I had learned to live with the questions that would never be answered. And then I snooped. I wish I could say it was intentional, that I went looking for the truth with purpose and determination, but it was more pathetic than that. A moment of weakness, a late-night scroll through social media that revealed what I had known in my bones for years. There she was, holding a little boy in her pictures, a child I had never known existed. The baby she had carried in secret with her best friend, a married man with 5 kids at home, while she whispered, "Love me forever" in my ear, in my home, while pregnant with his child. The discovery hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping on the floor of my own living room. Grief had shattered me once when I lost the people I loved to death. This lie, this profound betrayal of everything we had built together, shattered me again in ways that felt even more devastating because they were so completely preventable. I'm not angry now. I'm beyond bitterness, beyond the kind of rage that burns hot and bright and eventually burns itself out. I'm just incredulous. Incredulous that someone could look me in the eye, knowing what honesty meant to me, knowing how lies affected me physically and emotionally, and choose deception anyway. Incredulous that I had spent 2 years in therapy working on myself, taking responsibility for my part in our downfall, while she had been living with the knowledge that she had violated the one boundary I had ever asked her to respect. And in the midst of processing this betrayal, in the middle of trying to understand how someone could be so cruel, the phone rang again. But even as I was learning these hard lessons about justice and injustice, even as I was navigating the aftermath of Trishay's death and the betrayal of someone I had loved, I was also discovering something else. Something that would become the foundation for everything that came after. The bedrock upon which I would rebuild not just my life, but my understanding of what it means to be human in a world that can be breathtakingly cruel and unexpectedly beautiful, sometimes in the same moment. I was learning about the anatomy of grief, not just as an emotion, but as a force of transformation. Grief, I discovered, is a relentless sculptor, chipping away at everything you thought you knew about yourself, about love, about the very nature of existence. It strips away pretense and politeness and all the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about how the world works. It leaves you raw and exposed and fundamentally changed. But here's what I didn't expect. Sometimes that stripping away, that brutal honesty that grief demands, can be a gift. Sometimes losing everything you thought you needed can teach you what you actually can't live without. Sometimes the very thing that breaks you can also be the thing that shows you how strong you really are. There's a journal entry I wrote during the darkest period of this journey, when the weight of loss felt so overwhelming that I could barely function. I called it The Anatomy of Grief, when survival looks like a shower. Because that's what victory looked like for me in those days. Not climbing mountains or conquering fears, but simply standing under hot water and letting it cascade down my shoulders when I hadn't felt the strength to stand for days. I had been counting the minutes until bedtime, forgetting how to perform the basic rituals of living, wondering if the weight would ever lift. But healing, I learned, isn't linear. It doesn't follow a schedule or respond to our desperate need for it to hurry up and be finished. It arrives in whispers. In the moment you realize you've washed your hair without thinking about it, in the morning you wake up and remember something beautiful before you remember your loss. That shower, that simple act of self-care, was evidence. Evidence that somewhere beneath the numbness and pain, my body remembered how to care for itself. Evidence that I was still here, still moving forward, even when forward felt impossibly far away. Evidence that grief, for all its devastating power, hadn't succeeded in erasing me completely. This is The Anatomy of Grief, Part 2. Not a story of defeat, but of profound transformation. Not a tale of victimhood, but of the kind of strength that can only be forged in the fire of unimaginable loss. It's the story of learning that your worth isn't dependent on the fluctuating opinions of others or the ever-changing tides of societal approval. It's the story of discovering that some things, your intrinsic value, your capacity for love, your ability to survive what feels unsurvivable, are unconditional gifts that no one can take away from you, no matter how hard they try. It's raw, it's real, and it's just the beginning. Because while this chapter ends with the recognition of my own resilience, the story that follows is about what you do with that resilience once you've found it. It's about the choice between bitterness and wisdom, between isolation and connection, between letting grief define you and letting it refine you into something stronger and more beautiful than you ever imagined possible. The phone calls will keep coming. Loss will continue to be part of the human experience. People will lie, systems will fail, and justice will sometimes feel like a luxury we can't afford. But I've learned something that no amount of trauma can undo. I am more than the sum of what has happened to me. I am more than my grief, more than my pain, more than the worst things that have been done to me or the worst mistakes I have made. I am a survivor. I am a truth teller. I am someone who has looked into the abyss of human cruelty and chosen to believe in human goodness anyway. I am someone who has been stripped of everything and discovered that what remains is enough, more than enough, to build a life worth living. This is my story. This is my truth. This is the anatomy of grief, dissected and examined and ultimately transformed into something that can heal not just me, but anyone who has ever felt broken beyond repair. Because if I can survive this, if I can find meaning in this chaos, if I can transform this pain into purpose, then maybe, just maybe, you can too. The journey continues. The healing continues. The story continues. And I'm still here to tell it. And here I am, showing up fully transparent, vulnerable, these next pages to follow. I'm telling it all. End of chapter 1.